Well, good morning again. We have been in the last month or so going in a series on the Great Commission, really delving deeply into our core value that we are disciple makers. And so we have been going through the Great Commission phrase by phrase to recognize what does it mean to fulfill Christ's command. We have seen what it means that Jesus has all authority. We have seen what it means that we are disciples. We have seen what it means to go and make disciples. And this week we are going to focus on that little phrase, all nations. All nations is a grenade that has changed our world. One of the books that I've read over the last couple of years that I have found absolutely fascinating is this book, Dominion, by Tom Holland. Tom Holland is a historian of classical antiquity, like the Persian period, the Greek period, the Roman period. And he is not a believer. He is an atheist. But he has been fascinated with the history of Christianity. And he has written this book, Dominion, to trace how the power of this message of a man dying on the cross has changed the world. And so his perspective is not at all bent by, being an apologist for the faith, but he wrote this book, and in his introduction, he shares this. It's a long quote, but I want you to hear what he grasps about Christianity. He says, over the course of the past 2 decades, my perspective has changed. When I came to write my first works of history, I chose as my themes the 2 periods that had always stirred and moved me as a child: the Persian invasions of Greece and the last decades of the Roman Republic. But the more years I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien I increasingly found it. The values of Leonidas, whose people practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and trained their young to kill uppity Untermenschen by night, were nothing that I recognized as my own. Nor were those of Caesar, who is reported to have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. It was not just the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but a complete lack of any sense that the poor or the weak might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Because in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or Roman at all. Assumptions that I had grown up with about how a society should properly be organized and the principles it should uphold were not bred of classical antiquity, still less of human nature, but of that civilization's Christian past. You see, what Tom Holland was wrestling with and trying to grapple with is, why is the world that I see before Christ so much different than the world that exists after Christ? And he recognizes that the world that we live in, whether we explicitly bow the knee to Jesus or not, has been absolutely saturated with the message of Jesus. So that we find the dominion of Jesus in our calendar. We find the dominion of Jesus in the values that we assume. Many of the things that we see over the last 20 centuries are the direct result of Christian influence. I want to make you think about the status of women in culture. Before Christ came, women were property. But the gospel announced that women were heirs of the kingdom, and showed that women were valuable and precious and image bearers and cherished people of Christ. The institution of slavery was perpetuated over centuries and centuries, but when William Wilberforce finally grasped the freedom of the gospel and the equality that the gospel gives to all men, he chopped down the institution of slavery in Great Britain. It was his Christian convictions that finally killed slavery. And when we think about this last century and the great cause of civil rights of Martin Luther King, if you read his letter from Birmingham jail, you will see that Martin Luther King was simply taking his Christian heritage and calling the white Christians in this country, do you really believe this? Do you really live for these values that Christ has established? You see, we live in a world that has been changed by the gospel. And why? The reason that our world has been changed by the gospel is because the disciples before us took the call to carry the gospel to all nations. It is because all nations have received the gospel that we live in a Christianized world. Now, as we have started this series, I have put in front of you this image to kind of help us to think about why we need to be disciple makers. And it's this image of a match next to a series of matches. And the first match is lit, and you can understand that there will be a chain effect. As each match is lit, it will light the next match. This is a picture of darkness being overtaken by light as each match is lit. And I want you to see that as a picture of our present moment. Our present moment, this world has much darkness. Much darkness. Let me just pull out 3 terrifying examples. First is the horrible scourge of human trafficking. Over the last couple decades, slavery has erupted back into this world so that estimates of 20 to 50 million people are being trafficked as human slaves. It is reported that this is the fastest growing crime in our world. Think about the issue of tribalism. This us versus them thinking, this feeling that we cannot get along with other people, that there are other people in this world so different that the only thing we can think about is destroying them. We see all of the problems in the world as them and not as anything to do with us. What would make the world great is if it were us in charge. And we are seeing tribalism tear apart countries and families and churches. Consider just the mental health situation. We have our youth at skyrocketing numbers of depression and suicidality and anxiety because they are living in a world that has nothing to anchor them. They feel like chaff being blown by the wind. It is an epidemic, a mental health epidemic, that we are apparently the loneliest generation that has ever existed. And that loneliness is bearing bad fruit of substance abuse, of violence, of suicide. There is much darkness in our world. How do we combat that darkness? We must also take seriously the Great Commission's charge to take the gospel to all nations. If we want to defeat the darkness, we must again take the gospel to every part of this world. And I want today to give you 3 reasons why it is taking the gospel to all nations that will defeat the darkness wherever it is and whatever form it takes. I want to look at 3 reasons why. The first is that the gospel gives all people dignity. The gospel gives all people dignity. Now, when Jesus gives the Great Commission, He says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. That word all nations in Greek is panta ta ethne. And the first implication that I want you to grasp from this idea of all nations is that word all, the panta of it. It's that there is a comprehensiveness to the Great Commission. It wants the whole world to hear the gospel. It says that the gospel of Jesus Christ is a gospel to go everywhere to everyone. As the Great Commission in Mark is reported, Mark 6:15, it makes this very clear. It says, Jesus said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. We grasp with the word all nations that the gospel is to be given to everyone. Now, this is so significant because when we are told to give the gospel to everyone, we are told to announce to everyone in this world, you can be a child of God. We are to announce that to everyone. And what do I mean by everyone? I mean that message, you can be a child of God, is to the rich and to the poor, to the young, to the old, to the men and the women. It's a message to the strong and the weak, to the black, the white, the brown. It is a message to the native and the foreign. It is a message to the documented and the undocumented. It is a message to the diseased, to the healthy, to the abled, to the disabled, to the KU grad and the MU grad. I mean seriously, all people, everywhere, no matter who they are, where they come from, what categorizes them, everyone in the Great Commission is honored with the message, you can be a child of God. Jesus gave the Great Commission within the Roman Empire. And as you recall what Tom Holland said about the Roman Empire is that they did not believe in any inherent dignity of people. If you were a slave, you were worthless. If you were a woman, you were property. Your value, your dignity was wrapped up in who you were in the society. You see, without the gospel, in the world before the gospel, our world dehumanizes people. And it is the world that does not have the gospel. It is people who do not know the gospel that think that human trafficking is an acceptable way to make money. Because it must operate on the principle that the person I am trafficking is a worthless person. But we should not think that this is just something that happens out there. This same idea of the value of people based on things that culture assesses is something that permeates the highest institutes of thinking in our own country. I've shared before that now that we live in a world that is trying to understand dignity apart from the image of God, that the way dignity is assigned is ultimately based on a thing called personhood theory. And personhood theory is defined as basically evaluating your value based on what the culture values. Your personhood theory is not inherent, but it is something that a culture identifies as your value. It is this idea that causes us to debate whether the unborn are worthy of dignity or not. Because personhood theory argues that the unborn do not meet the criteria to value as human beings. You see, this idea of dehumanization exists wherever the gospel is absent. The gospel gives all people dignity. Listen, here's what the gospel does. The gospel declares all people are qualified by Christ to receive love, forgiveness, life, and a place in the family of God. Do you recognize the power that the gospel has in terms of creating dignity in a place that wants to dehumanize us? Consider what Paul said to the Colossians. Chapter 3, verse 11. He said to this crazy group of people that had been gathered by the gospel, he says, here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. You see, all of these people that Paul is mentioning are people that lived in vastly different spaces of human dignity and human worth. And yet Paul says Christ is in all of them. And therefore, your evaluation of their dignity is not in who they are in this world, but that Christ has claimed them. Now, Colossians is an interesting book because there were two letters sent. There was a second letter that was sent with the letter to the church of Colossae. And this second letter illustrates exactly the power of the gospel to give all people dignity and the vast implication of that. The second letter that came with the book of Colossae is this little book called Philemon. And in the book of Philemon, we are actually told that one of the members of the church of Colossae is Philemon, and one of the members of the church of Philemon is Onesimus. Now, here's the interesting thing. Onesimus was a slave, and Philemon was the owner of Onesimus. But in a remarkable event of God's providence, Onesimus escapes Philemon and runs into Paul, who is in prison. And Paul shares the gospel with Onesimus, a man who had been named useful. That's what Onesimus meant. His value was attached to his usefulness. And as a runaway slave, he was called useless. But Paul meets him. Paul doesn't see Onesimus as a slave. Paul sees Onesimus as somebody the gospel wants. And he gives the gospel to Onesimus. And Onesimus' identity goes from you are a slave and useless to you are a child of God and precious. And Paul sends Onesimus back to his church and back to his master. And he sends Philemon a special letter regarding what he needs to do with Onesimus. And here is what is said in verses 15 and 16. He says, "For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord." You see, what Paul is saying is the gospel has come. And Philemon, you cannot see Onesimus the same way any longer. This is the power of the gospel. It gives all people dignity. So wherever we announce the gospel, the darkness of dehumanization is removed with the light of human dignity. Now, the second reason why we need to take the gospel to all nations to defeat the darkness is that the gospel brings all people together. The gospel brings all people together. Now, when we read the Great Commission and we hear the words all nations, we must make sure that we read those words with first century ears. Because the way that we hear the word nations are geopolitical entities with, borders and the United Nations and different representatives. But the way that nations were understood in the hearing of Jesus is not geopolitical nations, but, as you probably can guess from the word ethne, more like ethnicities, more like people groups, more like bands and tribes and families and groups that are organized by similarities that have some sort of unique culture within them. And so when we think of people groups, we recognize that inside of a modern political nation, there are many people groups. Inside of a city, there are many people groups. And so Jesus is thinking not of the nation itself, but of the individual people groups that are inside of all of these nations. And so Jesus, when he says, I want you to go and make disciples of all nations, of all ethne, Jesus is announcing a revolutionary statement. He is saying, my gospel will make one people out of many different peoples. My gospel goes to all peoples, all ethnes. When you go back into the Old Testament, you go back to the very beginning, to Genesis chapter 12, and you read of God's call to Abram. We're told that God was going to make Abram a nation, and that nation became Israel. And for most of the Old Testament, we're thinking, okay, the story of God is about Israel. But in Genesis 12:3, we are told the ultimate reason why God chose Abram. And the reason is that in your name, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This was the promise that Israel was given through Abram at the very beginning. And for most of the Old Testament, that promise seemed to be dormant, basically forgotten. But it comes roaring to life, and it takes over the whole agenda right here in the Great Commission, where Jesus pulls that promise in Genesis 12:3 that all nations will be blessed to say, that's my gospel. My gospel is the one that will bless all families. Therefore, take it to all nations. Oh, this is such wonderful news, isn't it? I mean, this makes you tingle. The idea that the gospel is for every ethnic group, every people group you can think of. Except, ta ethne are also people not like us. The real problem with this great idea is that ta ethnes are different people. Think about the 11 disciples who are sitting there at the mountain, and Jesus is giving this final command. Now, the 11, they were good Jews. And the first thing that they had learned in their Talmud school is the word ethne is Gentiles. The word ethne is goy. That's the Hebrew word. They're the goyim. That's what the Jewish disciples are trained to hear when they hear Gentiles, when they hear ethne. They hear the goy. And to give you an understanding of just the way that the culture thought that Jesus is speaking into, the New International Dictionary on New Testament Theology and Exegesis, says this: in the view of rabbinic Judaism, the non-Israelite goy is a stranger to God and far from him, counting for nothing. As individuals, Gentiles have been given up to every possible vice, idolatry, immorality. In Jewish eyes, the Gentiles were unclean. They themselves, their wives and children, their houses and lands. What do you think Peter heard when he heard ta ethne? It was such a shocking statement that there's evidence he didn't really hear it. Because when you go into the book of Acts, there's this dramatic work done to the Apostle Peter to take the gospel to a Gentile. God gives him this vision of this canopy dropping with clean and unclean animals on it, and God proclaiming, all of this is clean. All of this is clean. And then as he finishes this dream, he's got a door knock, and it's an invitation from a Gentile to go and talk to a Gentile named Cornelius. And here's where Peter was even in this moment. In Acts chapter 10, verse 28, Peter said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation," ethne. "But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." You see, when Jesus said ta ethne, he was speaking to these 11 disciples that you're going to have to take this gospel to the people, all people, even the people you avoid, that you don't like. Can we relate to that tension that Peter probably felt? I mean, as we've already talked about, we live in a very us versus them culture. You are spending hours a day on social media getting your view validated and the opposite view smeared, so that it is just natural for us to see it is them. It is them. It's those people. We have an entire media industry and a political apparatus that is working on polarizing, that is saying there is no middle. You need to go to the outside, to the extreme. It's either or. And so we find ourselves in further and further distance from our own neighbors, our own friends, even our own family. I mean, we are all still shaking from the Charlie Kirk assassination. And probably what shakes me the most is within hours of the news of Charlie Kirk's assassination, it was us versus them. I was being told on one side, this is civil war. I was being told on the other side, this is civil war. That we no longer have discourse. And I mean, it was scary. But there is, even in the death of a person who was exercising free speech, whether we like his speech or don't like his speech, we couldn't even grieve and mourn because we had to get into our camps. This is the tribalism that we are living in, and it is tearing us apart. And so there are lots of ethnes that we are being trained to hate and distance. We are scared. We are angry. We block and we cancel. I admit there are a dozen people that I became Facebook friends with that I now have blocked. I have decided there is no common ground between us. I don't even want to know about your kids anymore. I mean, it's terrible. But we block, we cancel. We live in a world with divides that are getting wide and lines that are getting thick. And we need to remember the gospel still says to us, go to all ethne. Go to all ethne. All nations calls us to cross those lines, to bridge those divides for the sake of sharing Christ. Okay, how? How can I possibly have love that would cross the line of some of these divides? At this point, I want to exhort you to consider how to treat your enemies after considering how Christ treated you. Listen, Christ crossed the divide between heaven and earth. He crossed the divide between holy and unholy. He crossed the divide between life and death to make you his disciple. This is what he did. He chose love over wrath. Wrath that was justified. Wrath that was righteous. Wrath that was overdue. And yet we read Romans 5:8, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so as you think about the divides and the lines, if Christ has shed his blood to make peace, how can you keep division? This is what Peter finally realized after visiting Cornelius. He said in chapter 10, verse 34, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. If God shows no partiality, if he wants his gospel to go to the people that you hate, who are you to stop it? Listen, wherever we take the gospel, the darkness of hatred and division is removed with the light of Christ. And you want to know where that first light shines? It shines in us when we choose to see people as Christ sees them rather than as the world sees them. And that light that is in us that we share with others, it's beautiful. And it is the answer to the divisions and the thick lines in our world today. Beloved, what line do you need to cross for the sake of Christ? What line do you need to cross for the sake of Christ? You see, the gospel defeats the darkness. That's why we must take the gospel to all nations. And we still have one more reason why. The gospel offers all people hope. The gospel offers all people hope. Now, as we think about this phrase, panta ta ethne, it is from all nations. And so that idea of panta ta ethne has also got a distributive sense in it, in that we are to find people for Christ in every ethne, in every nation, in all places. And so it is a way of saying that the gospel is for anyone, anywhere. And we need to also be aware of how great of a task sharing the gospel is today. Right now, the most recent statistics identify the task that remains for us in sharing the gospel with people who have never once heard it, unreached people. Next slide, please, is 2.5 billion. There are 2.5 billion people on this earth that have never encountered the gospel because no one has gone to them. There are lots of anyones and there are lots of anywheres that the Great Commission has not yet reached. The Great Commission calls us to the whole world because it is the greatest need for every person everywhere. And this is one of the amazing things about the gospel. It is not a cultural imperialism when we bring the gospel to different cultures. In fact, it redeems cultures. What the gospel is the right diagnosis of what every person in every part of the world experiences. The gospel recognizes that everywhere in this world, people are shackled by shame and guilt and trauma and terror, a guilty conscience, depression, anxiety. In every place in the world, all of these things testify to every human heart because no human heart is unscathed. It all testifies that we are not right. There is something broken in us. There is something wrong in us. Every human heart knows the truth of Romans 3:23 before it is spoken, which says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so we live in a world that knows it is a broken person, an unfit person, an unworthy person. And they know in their nightmares that all that they can hope for is judgment. Because without the gospel, there is only judgment. When Jesus told us, go and take the gospels to all nations, he was saying that the gospel alone is necessary and sufficient to save all people. I want to unpack that. When we say that the gospel alone is necessary, this gospel, the one that we preach, is the one given by the one who says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. The words, go and take my gospel to all nations, are the words given by the risen Lord, the one who died on a cross and rose again to say that I am the way and the truth and the life. He is the only gospel. He is the only hope, the only answer. Peter says in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, the obvious truth. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. We live in a pluralistic culture that likes to think about going to heaven as finding a path up this mountain. And we're all told, well, you can take the mountain of the path of Mormonism or the path of Islam or the path of Hinduism or the path of Buddhism or just the path of being a good person. But that is so mistaken. Because when you recognize that the gospel comes from the one who has all authority, the one who died and rose again, there isn't many paths up the mountain because the mountain is Christ. The only way is Christ. The only path is Christ. Christ is the mountain. He is necessary. But also I want you to recognize that he is sufficient. As Peter shares the gospel with Cornelius, a Gentile, he finally recognizes what this all nations means. And he proclaims, to him all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. Who? Everyone. everyone receives forgiveness through his name. Beloved, the gospel that you have been given, the gospel that we preach, can save anyone, anywhere, from anything. Full stop. What is the gospel? If perhaps I have danced around this, the gospel I have already shared. It is that Christ has died for your sins and risen from the dead. And we receive the gospel as Romans chapter 10 describes. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Beloved, you need to have zero doubt about your soul, about your place in God's kingdom. Believe in the Lord Jesus. Confess him as the risen Lord, and you will be saved. Wherever the gospel is received, the darkness of sin, shame, and guilt is removed with the light of Christ's forgiveness. That's the good news. And that good news needs to be taken to all peoples. Beloved, the gospel is commanded to go to all nations because it is the only hope for a world perishing in darkness. The good news, though, as we think about this daunting task of going to all nations, of reaching the unreached, is that our mission will not fail. Because Jesus gave us a peek of the end. In Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, what does he say? After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Beloved, the people to be saved are there and they are ready. Let us go and share the gospel to all nations. There is much darkness in this world, but we have the light that cannot fail. Let us go and take on the darkness. Amen.